like, maybe this is good though. Maybe a catastrophic collapse would maybe be all right.
Yeah. I mean, this is the question. This is one of the questions that we can consider.
We can mull over.
Yeah. How do we feel about catastrophic population collapse?
Yeah, catastrophic population collapse seems pretty bad, but my political project, it might actually work out pretty well.
Yes. This is one for the like deep green primitivists in the audience.
Yes, for people whose tagline to their political ideology is,
in short, placing a military discipline on people and thereby creating what amounts to ecological fascism.
Exactly. Thank you, Murray Bookchin.
Thank you, Murray Bookchin.
Comrade, yes. Commissar Bookchin. Man, I've been waiting for an excuse to play that again for a very long time. So thank you, Malthusian population politics, for allowing me to play some Murray Bookchin. Dear. All right. Well, we were just saying don't have much banter, so we might just get into it. Actually, what I will say real quick right off the bat is big shout out to everybody that I met at the Anarchist Book Fair this past weekend. All very, very cool people. And I enjoyed seeing you and speaking to you, and you're all delightful, cool people that are doing cool things, much cooler than I am. So yeah, thanks a lot for that. But that was very cool. Let you know when there's another one going on, and hopefully we can meet more of you. But
the classic meetup.
The podcast meetup. Oh yeah, God, jeez, they can arrange those on their own, unfortunately. Should we get into it, Dan? We're talking. Yeah. So we're talking like this is an article, which of course I don't have anywhere near. It's called "After the Wave: Winter: Demographic Decline and the Production of Men in the 21st Century." It's in the Brooklyn Rail, and is by a fellow named Jason E. Smith. The second Jason that we've read for this show, I think, Jason W. Moore. I hope that was his first name. This is pretty good. This is basically all about like the looming demographic decline and population declines in the world. I'll be honest. Well, before we kind of get into it, I was a little bit like, even though I suggested this, I was a little bit like, this could go one of two very different ways. You know what I mean? Like whenever people start playing with the idea of like, it's like we were joking about a couple minutes ago. Like whenever people start joking about, or not joking about, but like playing with the idea of demographic decline and of collapse and of these different things, you can either fall into like an accelerationist viewpoint, which is always pretty worrying, or you can fall into a like Malthusian viewpoint. And I was kind of a little bit worried that this was going to be a bit Malthusian in its attempts to explain population decline. It definitely wasn't, but it's funny. There's something that talking about this makes me a little bit uncomfortable. I don't know if you feel the same.
I don't feel uncomfortable, but I feel like there is an uncomfortable conclusion that can be drawn. I mean, I guess it's worth saying that when we say population decline here, this essay isn't about like pandemics wiping out large swathes of the population or like
think about that.
Climate collapse or anything. This is just the simple mathematics of population growth and decline, and the seemingly low fertility rate that is developing or develops in sort of like advanced in terms of how advanced a capitalist economy can become in advanced economies in the world, and what the social, economic, and political outcome is of a population of a fertility rate that drops below a population's ability to reproduce itself. So a sort of like average child per mother ratio that drops below 2 kind of thing. I think in the essay they say like anything above a little over 2 is like enough to sustain a population, and then below that we get declining populations. So there's nothing like catastrophic in and of itself about the process, I suppose.
Yeah, that all needs to be mapped on later.
We can add the doom. We can bring the doom. You have to wait for the second half of the show to get that.
yeah. Stick around, listeners. This did bum me out. Because I did know. I mean, I didn't know a whole lot about this, honestly. I knew obviously about countries like Germany and Japan and South Korea and their declining like so-called fertility rates, right? Basically, as you're saying, the ability to grow as a population, to just put it simply. but I didn't really recognize that it was like a more or less global phenomenon, with the exception of, and this is kind of the main crux of the piece, sub-Saharan Africa, and kind of explaining why that is, who have had declining mortality rates for a while now, but booming fertility rates. So the populations in countries like Nigeria, specifically Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, places like this, are rapidly growing in a way that no real other region on the planet aren't. And it's pretty kind of grim stuff because, like, you know, obviously we'll get into kind of Marx's, polemic with Malthus and this kind of idea that you kind of have to center a given society's method of production if you want to talk about demographic change to really understand it. And this idea that, there aren't really necessarily hard and fast absolute limits within reason to kind of how big a society can get, just as long as it kind of is able to organize itself in a way that is able to sustain that growing population. But the picture that's painted in this essay is not particular. It's pretty grim. It's kind of grim. Not necessarily when we discuss kind of the sub-Saharan African places where the populations are growing, but kind of the outlook that a massive decline in population presents for capital and for capitalist accumulation is one that the author basically says points towards a collapse at some point, because obviously there's one thing we know about capitalism, it's that it needs to constantly be growing. And he's basically saying within the next few decades, we're going to hit a point where it is just not going to be able to, unless something changes, but he seems to think that isn't necessarily going to be the case. So this put me in a bit of a grim mood.
Yeah, there's that, and then layered on top of that, there's the kind of like just the basic social crisis that the implications for general reproduction of society, even beyond a capitalist mode of production. I mean, there isn't much in this about how a hypothesized post-capitalist society might meet and deal with these challenges differently. I mean, we can surmise some of the things that some of the ways in which a social society might be able to better meet these challenges, but just from the simple standpoint of having what results from a declining population is, particularly in advanced countries where the life expectancy is so high, what you get is an aging population, and the sort of the basic economic failing on a certain level is there just isn't enough of a working population to support the sort of non-working, I guess, retiree population of a country, I suppose. So, so there's sort of there's the crisis that looms for the basic mechanisms of the capitalist mode of production and how that functions. But there are sort of broader crises of sort of like generalized social reproduction that loom as a result of that. It's funny because like when you I mean, I guess there's the kind of like the very nihilist doomer reaction. It's like there's too many of us anyway, and the population needs to go down, and the earth will thank us, and blah blah blah. I mean, I'm not like on my more doom laden days, I'm not entirely inconsiderate to that sort of rationale, although it's not my politics. But on a base level, it doesn't necessarily like. There's the moral consequences of an unfolding process, and as an unfolding process, this has some grim implications. But other than the prospect of the human race going extinct entirely, I mean, there isn't. I don't think there's a morally right human population in and of itself.
Yeah.
It's like. So I mean, if we get to a point where there are only 2 billion or 1.5 billion or however many human beings on the planet, so be it. But how that process happens is the one that has like grim, inhuman, antisocial consequences attached, I suppose.
All around bad consequences.
All bad.
Well, you're absolutely right to say that it's that process, because we'll get to this later on, where he talks about how there is actually no quote unquote natural fertility level for humans. There's never been one. It's always dependent on the society that they're in and what's going on in that society, and production relations, blah, 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 blah. And it also, like, we'll get into what it is we're actually talking about in terms of this demographic collapse now, because it's not like we're saying like 5 billion people are just going to die. Like, it is going to be a quote, like, as natural as this process can be, it's going to be a natural process. So we'll get into it now, I guess, what it is that he's actually talking about, why it is that the world's population is going to so drastically decline by the end of the century. The roots of this, I suppose, all begin with a kind of bourgeois understanding of population demographics, which is to say, as human beings kind of transition away from agriculture, from, you know, agriculturally like based subsistence, something like feudalism, which tends to have roughly equal fertility and mortality rates. So fertility rates which is to just say the rates at which people are having children. Mortality rates, which is to say the rates at which people are dying. They're generally equal. You know, we kind of always tend to think of feudalism as this kind of, you know, mode of production that exists within stasis. We've spoken about before how that isn't necessarily exactly true, and it's actually that imbalance that kind of, in some senses, led directly to capitalism. But for the most part, it was generally these two rates were more or less, with some deviations, in accordance with each other, and populations remained stable, if at like a very gradual, slow growth rate. But kind of, and again, this is the bourgeois understanding of the way that this happens, as kind of healthcare becomes qualitatively better and quantitatively increases to different parts of the globe, mortality rates drop quite significantly, but fertility rates continue to climb. And in fact, we'll get into what actually happens, which is that fertility rates, with the onset of capitalism, rise quite significantly, at least for a time. But then eventually, again, this is the bourgeois understanding of things, you get to a point where education becomes more prevalent in certain societies, women get access to better forms of contraception, and fertility rates tend to stabilize and drop. And eventually you get to a point, which is where most of the global north and the kind of imperialist core is at now, which is reaching a peak, and indeed as early as kind of like 40, 50 years ago, beginning to a decline in population, which is going to play itself out over the next 75 years. Kind of blew my mind when he was like, in 2100 is when, you know, this will really start to be insane. And I was like, wow, 100 years. And he was like, 75 years from now. And I was like, oh my God, I might still be alive. Jesus Christ. Well, yeah, we'll see about that. But that's generally the kind of like base understanding of this demographic change, which is these fluctuations that we got with the onset of capitalism, of fertility rates that continued to rise while mortality rates dropped, which creates a pretty massive population boom. And where we're at now, which is where those two rates are beginning to be a bit more in sync. And over the next few decades, where mortality rates are going to once again kind of overtake fertility rates for a variety of factors. So that's how he sets up this essay and how he kind of frames his critique of that understanding.
Yeah, what's really quite fun about the narrative in this essay, or the sort of construction of the argument, is that it seems to sort of descend through layers of nuance and sort of add sort of greater degrees of clarity, I suppose. And also there's a sort of wrestling with, we love a little bit of this kind of argumentation where it's kind of like wrestling with bourgeois theory and bourgeois theoreticians from the standpoint of Marxist analysis, I guess. But yeah, as you say, like, it's not just necessarily mortality rates, but like infant and mother mortality rates, right? And so, and obviously we're dealing with populations that the cause and effect isn't instantaneous in this kind of analysis. So obviously, like, population booms, or the sort of consequences of population booms, are felt like as generations proceed, if that makes sense. So like, obviously there are, that at this sort of basic level of analysis from a bourgeois standpoint, there are factors which make childbirth safer for mothers, and then also increase the survival rates of children. But that doesn't instantaneously lead to a change in mindset whereby like reproducing human beings are choosing to have fewer and fewer children. And so you could sort of get these extended lead times where the boom follows on a long way after the sort of perceived change in circumstances surrounding childbirth. What I did enjoy about this essay, or that there's something very like sci-fi about this narrative. In some ways, it adds to the doom of it. You know, like there is the kind of like, I don't know what sci-fi future best encapsulates it, but there is a certain like Blade Runner element to this kind of thing. Like, but it's interesting to put it in such stark perspective just how massive a transition this is. The author of this essay talks about sort of two perceived big tipping points in human population growth that can be seen in the history of Homo sapiens, I suppose. One of them is the Neolithic agricultural revolution, which sort of like took the human population from the hundreds of thousands into the millions. And then through the sort of history of the last like 3,000 or 4,000 years, I suppose, up until the beginning of the capitalist era, there were fluctuations, but there was a sort of like general stagnation with a sort of ticking up increase in population, but nothing huge, for reasons that we'll get into in a minute if we discuss the nature of various modes of production and how they influence the reproduction rate of the population. And then with the onset of what sort of like non-Marxist theoreticians might talk about as the Industrial Revolution, but from a Marxist standpoint, we would call like the onset of capitalism, I suppose, because these demographic changes and the sort of like socio-political, economic causes actually predate the beginning of the rapid onset of industrialization, I suppose, proper. But yeah, you just get these two big increases, and one of the possible things to take away from reading this is that actually this level of human population on the Earth might really be a huge anomaly in the wider history of our species, I suppose. A sort of like 200 or 300 year blip when our population is in the many, many billions. That might not be the norm if one day we're able to look back over sort of like longer, deeper human history, I guess.
Yeah. Most of the time, I'm like, thank God I'm alive in the time with penicillin. But this made me be like, man, I could have been born like 100 years from now when we have perfect socialism. The world's population is like much lower. The buffalo are back. You know what I mean? It's just like, what are you going to do? That's a bit Malthusian of me.
Right. Yeah. Well, I was thinking about that. There's in terms of like there's a sort of paradox, a sort of observer paradox that like sometimes leads people to think, or a sort of standpoint paradox where you sort of assume what you recognize, what you can see around you is the norm. I think there's a sort of application to this where sort of like, well, it makes sense that we're living now because our biggest chance of being alive is now, you know, like the chances of us, if we had the possibility of being born at any point, like the likelihood is spread across all the possible distributions, like we would be born in these few centuries somewhere. I mean, better now than 150 years ago, I suppose. And like,
true.
But like,
yeah. I mean, yeah, I feel like I probably would have died like 5 times over if I wasn't born now. So fair enough. I think it's foundation. I think this is all very foundation.
Yes.
I think that's kind of what I've been thinking.
Yeah.
I'm writing for whatever the scientist's name is in that to come out of his holographic tomb and be like, here's what you have to do. Labor time planning. That would be so funny if it adds a mom's book. It's just like, here's what you need to do. There's a thing called the general working hour. Well, the Neolithic Revolution stuff was interesting. I would have liked, I mean, obviously this is an online article. He's not going to be able to go into like loads of detail. I would have liked a bit more about that because he kind of says on one hand, you know, in hunter-gatherer societies, there were these, it's theorized that there were such small human populations because when you're migratory, you need to maintain pretty strict population discipline, and you need to kind of practice abortion, practice, in extreme cases, infanticide, practice like, I guess, hunter-gatherer abstinence or something like that, just because it's a lot harder and takes a lot more energy and resources to care for a child when you're walking around all over the place than when you're settled. So that's one theory for why populations back then were so stable. So it's like on one hand, when you have this Neolithic revolution and people settle down in one place, you would expect populations to grow because they could. But then on the other hand, he's like, you have massive, like when you concentrate people like this, you just create the perfect conditions for disease and for plague and for all of this stuff. So you'd also expect it to decline. But then he's like, but then kind of my reading of it is that you also need, there was a much bigger demand for labor. And so you had people having more kids. Not too much more is expanded on it beyond that, because that kind of winds up being the argument for a number of population growth, like growth spurts, right? And maybe it is just that simple. Agriculture requires a bunch of people to work on it. When there's a demand for labor, there are going to be more people. But it's just interesting, that kind of, you know, yeah, I don't know. Something I got to think about a little bit more, because it left me kind of wanting a little bit more about an explanation for the kind of big population boom that occurred then. But I guess if I just take a step back, it's like it makes sense that a lot more people were able to be fed and a lot more people were able to be born, even if, you know, mortality rates were still quite high. Partially because there's a demand for labor, partially because you could just grow a bunch of food and didn't have to rely on wandering around all the time.
Yeah, I mean, in this essay, they talk about like the threats that come from grouping in one place, like novel diseases and that kind of thing. I think we've read in the past, or I've come across in the past, the idea that actually there was quite a big decline in the like nutritional quality of the food that was being eaten, like the general level of health stemming from the quality of food actually declined. And it's not necessarily, I mean, I've come across this idea in the past, like it's not necessarily a no-brainer that as a society you would choose to switch to arable farming as opposed to sort of any kind of hunter-gathering, as evidenced by the fact that there are still hunter-gatherers today, right? Not everybody, as much as they are now being destroyed by the sort of like global dominance of the capitalist social relations, like people did choose to continue to be hunter-gatherers, and it might be part of this balancing act. One of the, I mean, you referenced it before, and I think we'll wait a little while to talk about it properly. But like, one of the things that was most interesting about this essay was this argument that like there is no natural population reproduction, right? And I suppose there are sort of material factors that influence people's choices, but in all cases, there's also this sort of social element. People are choosing whether to have children or not, whether it's a sort of personal or familial choice, or whether it's one that's dictated by societal or cultural norms and decisions. And I suppose potentially in the face of a potentially like less healthy existence, potentially resulting from a switch to fixed agriculture, there might be this decision, well, okay, the survival rate of like infants is now significantly reduced. Let's try and have more. Let's the resulting choice would be to recognize that there's a potential for your children not to survive, so you try and have more. I guess we could come on to talking about what I perceive anyway, this author's argument to be vis-a-vis the sort of like economic social relations of feudalism, or it almost feels like you could group all kinds of all modes of production that center around farming and the productivity of land into sort of one generalized mode of production, all the way from the sort of Neolithic agricultural revolution all the way through until the capitalist revolution, from the standpoint of population, at least, the basic difference between like the feudal mode of production and the capitalist mode of production in this instance being that feudalism is interested in the productivity of land, and capitalism is more interested in manipulating the productivity of laborers. And so under any sort of agricultural, feudal or peasant based mode of production, the primary limit on the population is just how many people can the land support. Whereas that's one of the shifts that sort of like changes with the onset of capitalism, with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. One of the things that's so revolutionary and sort of world historic about that process, I guess. But so coming back to the Neolithic, that's the revolution. One of the things that they're switching to is we now have the capacity to make considerably more food because we're doing fixed farming. Now we can expand into up to this new natural upper limit for the population, which is now defined by the productivity of the land that we're farming, and not other factors like how easy it is to do hunter-gathering, I guess.
I wonder if we're going to get hunter-gatherers in some sections of society in socialism. That'd be pretty funny. That'd be kind of cool. Socialist, you politically decide as a community.
It's the socialist dumpster diver.
Yeah. All of that stuff is really interesting. I think I was trying to figure out what book it was, but it was Perry Anderson's book on the transition from antiquity to feudalism, I think, where he talks about what we've read for the show, where he talks about how there was actually some, in comparison to capitalism, very small, but in reality still quite existing impetus for growth in feudalism. And again, you're quite right to emphasize, though, that growth came from a desire to kind of appropriate more land and to make land more arable, right? This is why in late kind of the high Middle Ages and towards the latter part of feudalism, we've talked about this before, about how, you start to see all of the old growth forests in Europe be destroyed, and you start to see wolves going extinct because their habitats are destroyed and stuff like this, right? Because
some really massive like land reclamation projects.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because you really just start to see the aristocracy mainly, but then also some peasants, because they were being squeezed, try and go after more and more of the commons and go after more and more of just quote unquote like wilderness, right? So yeah, all of that stuff is really interesting. I think maybe now we can kind of talk about the second population boom, which does come with the onset of capitalism. And he emphasizes at first, the bourgeois understanding of this population boom is kind of more or less a technologically determinist one, right? Because it's not using the framework of historical materialism like all smart people do. It's basically just saying, you got the tractor, you got the steam engine. Yeah, exactly. Got it. Wish I had glasses to do that. Got the steam engine, you got the tractor, you got railroads and all of this stuff eventually. So you started to see the capability of increased, agricultural production. Probably bourgeois intellectuals will bring up the enclosures and stuff like that as the kind of impetus for this massive population boom that took place in kind of the latter part of the 18th century and almost the entire part of the 19th century in places like Western Europe, but then also in China and in Japan, various places, right? Eventually in the United States. But he says the salient feature of this capitalist population boom isn't the kind of technological breakthroughs, but actually the separation of peasants from their own means of subsistence, which is to say their own means of production, separating them from their land. Because once that kind of, as we spoke about before, like this kind of relatively like stable population sizes of feudalism, which is to say kind of balanced mortality and fertility rates, was thrown into disarray because households were thrown into disarray because people were thrown off their land and forced to become wage laborers, kind of here specifically talking about like England, right? This completely removed all of the constraints that were previously on household sizes. And the kind of key part for what we're going to talk about and what the article talks about is that exactly what you're saying, Dan, that the emphasis was no longer placed on the productivity of land, but on the productivity of labor. And there was a pretty massive demand for labor at this point. And more or less, that's kind of these things all coincide and you start to see a massive population boom. He gives numbers in here, but, England's population, I don't know, it went up a lot. I'll just say that, and various parts of Europe, and as I said, all over the world that were experiencing this same kind of transformation of social relations, start to see their populations double, triple, and quadruple, kind of in the blink of an eye. And he makes a point that this it was and kind of continues to still be pretty historically unprecedented. And as you say, will probably wind up going down as an anomaly, hopefully much like capitalism itself.
Yeah, I mean, a part of the figure that's been attacked in this essay to some extent is Adam Smith, and how he theorizes the relationship, I suppose, between population growth and the needs of nascent capitalism. For Smith, it's just quite a simple calculation. It's a question of supply and demand. There is increased demand for labor under capitalism, and therefore the market shifts and more stock of human beings is produced to meet demand, kind of thing. There are quite a lot of ways in which this feels sort of evidently absurd, but then also, like, the author deploys a critique from Marx, which takes into account more the sort of inner workings of capitalism and adds a lot of sort of nuance to this. I mean, I feel like the most evidently problematic thing about that is, like, the lead time on that is far too long to sort of coincide with our understanding of how rapidly capitalism tries to adapt itself, I suppose. Like, capitalism isn't going to wait 12 years, let alone 18 years, to like have its needs met when it comes to an increasing demand for labor.
At least it was better than Malthus, though.
Yeah.
This whole argument in this article is done really well, because he gives you Malthus's argument, then he gives you Smith's argument, which is like obviously an improvement on Malthus's, and then he gives you Marx's argument, and he's like, no more theorizing needed. No, just kidding. But he does say that Marx obviously, like, did a critique of political economy. He did the subtitle of the book and was able to kind of improve on these ideas. Stuff like this I love so much, because you really do see that Marx was just another guy in the long line of political economists, right? Like, obviously he's criticizing political economy, so I don't want to just say that he was one of these people. He obviously, created a brand new school of thought, but you can see where he's getting a lot of these ideas from. I mean, I had no idea, for example, that in this article he goes into Adam Smith's criticism of the iron law of wages. And I was like, wait a minute, I thought that was Marx's like whole thing, right? Because Adam Smith says that wages aren't set by the base subsistence needed, that they're always going to tend towards the lowest possible wage, the base subsistence needed for laborers. He actually says they settle when population growth and kind of labor demand are in match, which Marx will later go on to critique that. But it is an interesting point, right? That it's like, it's another one of these times when you kind of just want to like slap LaSalle and be like, for fuck's sake, like, even Adam Smith knew what he was talking about and was able to kind of get past this. But one more thing I'll say on that is just that we all, I think, probably know the thing that Malthus is famous for, which is the thing that we call Malthusian, which is his idea of population. He basically saw population growth as completely constrained by scarcity, and, was kind of one of these doomsday elite bourgeois types who was like, look at the wretched underclasses reproducing at a disgusting rate like rabbits. They're going to cause society to collapse because, look, we can only grow so much wheat. We can only have so many cows. Whereas Marx came along and was like, no, actually societies like tend to be able to, well, not tend to be able to adapt. That kind of doesn't come into it at all. But he basically says that societies do implement new technological labor-saving changes, specifically capitalism, to kind of meet this need, and the population growth and its relation to wages and its relation to capital accumulation is much more nuanced than Malthus, for one thing, his explanation, but then also even Adam Smith's account. But like I said, you can see that Marx was pretty clearly like building on Adam Smith's account,
Mm-hmm. I think one of the mistakes that's sort of often made in this sort of description of this transition, right, is that like all the peasants were just like shunted off the land and straight into the factories. And one of the things that's built out in this a bit more is that there's sort of like greater nuance to that. Obviously, there is the onset of the sort of capitalist mode of production that long predates the onset of like the factory system and industrialization proper. And one of the things that's interesting about this text is it really centers it on choices that are being made motivated by material economic conditions, but choices that are being made by the sort of like newly free peasant population, because so much early capitalist industry was carried out in the cottage, in the family, and suddenly there was the impetus. There was an economic rationale for larger families so that children could be made to work in these sort of like cottage industries, sort of spinning cotton and what have you, whatever was happening long before this process was transitioned into its sort of full capitalist factory form. And so it's quite interesting. It's interesting to put that in that sort of like broader context as a much more drawn out transitionary process, but one which centers around the freeing of labor of peasants from the land, making them wage workers, but recognizing that there was a transitionary process whereby the sort of like generalized means of production didn't really change that much, but the social relations changed fundamentally in the sense that peasants were no longer tied to feudal lords, but became capitalist wage workers properly. And that's when you sort of transition into the general interest being around how can we make workers work more and work harder, rather than how can we make the land produce more for us, kind of thing. Which I think sort of moves us into the sort of like central crux of some of the discussions, both around Marx, but sort of around the sort of general economic implications of this sort of population decline for the functioning of capitalism itself, right? Because like
it needs a reserve army, which is basically kind of what it all comes down to. That I think is the most interesting stuff, right, about his kind of discussion of Marx here, is because whenever any author in something that we read for the show is like, this mirrors Marx's theory of real and formal subsumption, I'm like, yes, let's get it, because that happened when we were reading the Schwang thing, Social Contagion, all about COVID, and it was like the real informal subsumption of plagues, and it's happening here, and I just love it. It's so cool. It's very applicable to a number of different things, because basically what the author here is saying, well, what Marx is saying, I should say, is that capital and its accumulation have had two distinct phases in its relationship to population growth and population demand and like labor demand. And again, that's mirrored in the kind of phases of capitalism. And he kind of says, you can see where someone like Smith and someone even like Malthus are coming from in the earliest stages of capitalism, right? Because in the early days, when capitalists were basically just concerned with taking over the feudal apparatuses, doing what they could with them, with private labor, with wage labor, and kind of just trying to expand the rate of surplus extraction, absolutely, which is to say, this was formal subsumption. This was when they were basically concerned with just getting more labor and having people work, more, and kind of, exploiting them a little bit more, which is to say, this was early capitalism, was when the working day was really, really long, right? Because they said, we just need more units of labor. It was very much a quantitative question. This is when kids were, in factories and losing their arms because they just needed more labor. Women, house, I suppose like moms and, young mothers and pregnant women and kids and everybody, the old, were just working in the shitty kind of English factory that you think of. This is kind of the formal subsumption of capital. But he makes the argument, Marx does, that capitalism couldn't kind of just, what's the word he uses? It couldn't kind of just be happy with, content itself with this kind of surplus extraction, because it is going to run into a natural barrier, and the natural barrier of that is population size, right? There's a certain point where you just kind of can't keep adding more units of labor. So what do is you qualitatively change that labor. This is real subsumption, right? This is when capitalists stop being as much interested in just adding more units of labor and start being interested in labor saving devices, right? We've spoken about this a bunch when we spoke about Andreas Malm's Fossil Capital, because this is kind of the crux of his argument around why fossil fuels were adopted, to kind of discipline labor in this way. And it's the crux of the argument here for why capitalism's relationship to demographic changes and population changes qualitatively shifts in its kind of early, I suppose like early history, when the transition from formal subsumption to real subsumptions happens. Because once real subsumption fully takes place and capitalists are no longer interested in just adding more units of labor, but in labor-saving devices to up productivity, what they need is basically a stable pool of labor that they can always go to and push people out into of unemployed workers when businesses expand and contract. So Marx is having a much more nuanced take on the relationship of capitalism to population by basically saying these things are kind of indirectly influenced each other, but that is also to say that capitalism needs loads of people that just aren't engaged in labor at the moment. It needs a reserve army of labor of people that just kind of sit there, and it needs a state to look after them until there's another boom cycle and they can all be hired, and then there's another bust cycle and they can all be fired again. So again, it's a much more nuanced take, and it's kind of clearly more convincing, as you say, than Adam Smith's when we need more labor, people have more kids.
That you've hit on both of like Marx's key retorts to Smith, I guess, like, and that question of like the length of time it would take for, simply by virtue of people choosing to reproduce more and faster, for that to have an influence on the economy. Obviously, capitalism is going to find different ways to mediate that. And as you say early on, its first decision is to just sort of like drive more and more people into the factory, the young and the old, and women, and sort of like make everybody work. But like coming up against that natural limit, then it's got to sort of break beyond that and sort of develop technologically as well to further increase productivity. I suppose. I mean that's what we're saying that's what's being said when we describe capitalism as being primarily interested in the productivity of labor as its sort of primary motivation, I guess. But one of the interesting implications coming back to population decline is that like one of the sort of like sort of accelerationist kind of answers would be, well, we'll just replace all this labor when we have all of these old people that need caring for, or when we don't have sufficiently many people working in agricultural factories to support an aging population who can't work anymore. We'll just let machines take over from that. Now the sort of basic tenets of Marxism aside, that it's the people working that actually substantially create the value that goes on to be sort of capitalist profits. But not all forms of work can be automated at the same rate and in the same way. And if we're going to end up with this like really bloated sort of care sector, we're just not going to be able to automate in the ways necessary potentially to meet those needs and demands of that sort of changing social dynamic, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It feels like for a number of reasons, capitalism is kind of running up against the limits of real subsumption. Exactly what you're saying is because most of the growth now is coming from service heavy industries and really like immediate tech bubbles, right? Where there's massive hope because capitalism needs to find a way for productivity gains to outstrip and outgrow the decline in population that the world is currently seeing. But so it's going to be looking for these massive technological kind of wonders, one hit things where, AI comes along and just solves this once and for all. But it's realizing that none of those promises are exactly real. And most of them are kind of snake oil, right? And exactly what you're saying, where there is growth and kind of, or where there needs to be growth in kind of service industries, you kind of can't really automate those. And this is just another reason why a lot of this stuff is pretty grim when it comes to kind of the outlook for demographic changes, is because these demographic changes are going to take place within a given, productive mode. And that productive mode is not necessarily going to be capable for looking after these people. And it's going to, the author predicts, start acting in more and more irrational ways, trying to kind of curtail these demographic losses, right? So he predicts that something like, feminism will obviously be used for a scapegoat, because women trying to exert more bodily autonomy will, the ruling class will try to paint them as selfish for doing that in an age of declining, fertility rates and declining populations. And he kind of gives the example of, you can see how states try and curtail things like this do, when you look at the United States and psychotic draconian rules, anti-abortion laws, which is interesting. Like, I wonder if a bit more nuance is needed there, because I do feel like, well, I think that is probably a pretty strong high level argument. So much of those laws are passed just because, like, people are just psychotic, like sexists and like misogynists, and they're just trying to like drum up support for whatever fascist project they're trying to build. The United States it's going into like relatively stable population rates, but it is still growing, and I think it's still supposed to be growing by the end of the century. So maybe that argument doesn't hold up as well. But yeah, for some reason, I'm always a little bit wary of kind of typical materialist answers to why American abortion laws are so insane, because I think American politics are just too psychotic to explain it like that. Maybe I'm wrong, but
I mean, it's hard to imagine that a purely political economic driving force lies behind the propagation of those kind of ideas. I mean, I do wonder whether it's possible for that kind of political motivation to reach a degree of salience because of some kind of social experience that people are having. But as you say, mostly it's just motivated by
gross,
sort of like
people being fucking gross,
psychotic, like
yeah. And also,
cruel,
I think a lot of
human politics, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of it, I think, it's funny because in my brain, I was trying to relate this essay to the Emmy O'Brien piece that we read on the ways in which families are qualitatively changing and have changed, and what that family has meant throughout the history of capitalism. And I think she hit on something really good in that essay, where she was basically like, a lot of this kind of misogyny comes from men seeing their like seats of power or whatever within the kind of typical family that we've known for like the last century or so, like the bourgeois family, slip away. And, as a reason male suicide rates are so high, I suppose she kind of makes the argument that that's one of the reasons. And so, yeah, I kind of tend to think that a lot of this, like, as you say, anti-human politics tends to come more from that angle. But hey, maybe one of these days, because it's just like, how does a typical like political like materialist explanation for that explain why women get thrown in prison for crossing state lines to have an abortion? Like, I'm not necessarily sure that it can. But I also don't think the author would necessarily disagree with that.
I mean, maybe the argument that's been made in this piece is not that, but like these kind of policies might be picked up by more mainstream political actors, I suppose, who are concerned by population decline and the knock-on impact on capitalism's ability to maintain profit rates. So
yeah, that actually, I was going to ask you about this because it's a similar thing in here about the argument for populist anti-immigration policies, because he kind of just drops kind of briefly about like, you would expect, the ruling class in America, say, to want more immigrants. You would certainly expect them to want more immigrants in Germany, but what are you seeing is like historically high rates of alternative for Deutschland types getting elected, right? Like bordering on fascist policies towards immigrants. And you do see like your Angela Merkel types did implement loads of pro-immigration policies to try and stem Germany's particularly drastic population decline. But then you also do get these populist types. And it was interesting because he was saying, it will be hard for the ruling classes of these countries to try and have more pro-immigration policies like that because of the rise of populism. But yeah, I was just thinking, I was like, well, surely like the impetus behind a lot of these populist movements, they're not like grassroots movements, you know what I mean? Like these are factions of the ruling class. And so I was just wondering, like, I wonder what it is, if anything, wonder what the motivations of certain fractions of the ruling class would be to have anti-immigration policies, presumably just like heavy austerity types, factions that don't, you know, maybe don't rely on immigration or something like that. Because I was thinking, I don't know. Now I'm just kind of spitballing because I was thinking like, typically you imagine like agriculture in the United States, specifically in places like California, that's, you know, predominantly for the last century, or not century, but for the last while has been done by a lot of, there's been high rates of illegal immigrants working in those fields, no pun intended. But maybe now that's actually changed. And maybe now they just have, through unionization and whatever, they have like a stable supply of low waged, highly exploited workers, and they don't need illegal immigrants anymore. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I mean, you can see, and I think it's kind of predicted in this piece, you can definitely foresee a shift happening whereby you sort of transition to almost having multiple classes of workers. Like you could foresee immigrants being brought in on visas with contracts that they're tied into, whereby the work is connected to, or that their visa and their right to be in a country is connected to doing one particular type of work, and their the wages that they're made to accept, and therefore the rate of exploitation can be kept artificially high because they're sort of like a second class citizen exploited immigrant class within the boundaries of one state. So I can definitely foresee that as a potential solution. And in that instance, a kind of like anti-immigrant politics might be quite advantageous in to the degree that which it was necessary to dehumanize people such that you could maintain quite a strict two-class working population, I suppose.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I suppose just tight control over the flow of labor,
yeah.
Especially if you're and what you're saying, I think that's absolutely correct, because we already do see that. I mean, you know, in the early days of kind of Californian agriculture, what you would literally get is American robber barons going to the border, picking up a bunch of people, telling them, hey, yeah, you can come and live in America. And at the end of harvest season, calling the, you know, immigration police and getting them all deported, right? But I mean, even today, what you see, like, how did all of the World Cup stadiums in Qatar get built, right? It was literally over basically like slave labor, where they took people's passports and forced them to work like slaves. So it is exactly what you're saying. Yeah. It's complicated, I suppose. Yeah, that's one thing that I've learned. All this stuff, very nuanced.
Very complicated.
Yeah, very nuanced. Okay, so I mean, how does all of that then relate to the central question of this, which is trying to explain, I suppose, one of the questions. Why is it that sub-Saharan Africa still hasn't achieved this kind of demographic transition, which is what all of the bourgeois types like to call it, right? Why, despite, you know, well, maybe we should say more readily available forms of contraception, and say like mortality rates having declined quite drastically in places like Nigeria, in places like Ethiopia, and all these different places. Why is it that we're still seeing massive population booms, right? And I suppose maybe just to frame this question and to kind of explore why it is a little bit more complicated and different to the kind of transition that the global north has found itself having underwent, we can just kind of, maybe I'll just say a few statistics. He basically says that Nigeria, despite having 95% employment, only 12% of that employment is actually waged, right? And he says that in Nigeria specifically, 40% of the entire population is below the poverty line. And all of this stuff kind of just gets into his explanation for why there is still such a growing population, which is he's using Marx's kind of thinking and, you know, way of, I suppose, thinking about population decline or population growth and its relationship to capital accumulation, which is to basically just say these are places that are still semi-proletarianized. And because of their place in the global distribution of labor, the global division of labor, I should say, are reaching a place where they kind of cannot be fully proletarianized. And within the purview of this paper, maybe won't be fully proletarianized, at least not for a very long time, insofar as such a thing is even possible. And yeah, that kind of leads you with like a, so then what? You know what I mean?
Yeah, they're existing under conditions of analogous to an economic system built around cottage industries that existed in the very early stages of capitalism, right? Where you haven't reached capitalist, a sort of fully developed capitalist mode of production and industrialization. And obviously it's not the same circumstances, but I think it's being sort of tied into the same transitionary process, although as you say, it's a transitionary process that's been stalled out. Significant implications for population demographics in that part of Africa compared to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and when he's the reason that kind of statistic about 95% employment but only 12% actually having regular waged employment is so important is because he says the type of labor that most people actually do then is work in personal services, street vending, repairs, and petty trading. Those are the examples that he gives, and these are all sectors that do not necessarily lend themselves to be kind of really subsumed by capitalism in the way that a lot of the sectors in the global north did, right? And this is the reason that he kind of rolls his eyes at a number of different kind of bourgeois ideologues who kind of say, well, all we really need to do is just make Nigeria the next China, right? Which is to say it needs to undergo a rapid process of capital accumulation and industrialization, blah, 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 mainly capital accumulation, right? And at that point, there will be a proletarianization of the workforce, and you will start to see the kind of demographic decline that the rest of the world is seeing. But the author is basically saying there aren't many industries that can be offshored to Nigeria and places like that, like they could be in China, right? Like at this point, the things that capital, as we have said, global capital is trying to automate are the service industries. And these are the industries that most people are employed in irregularly in Nigeria. These things can't really be offshored and they can't be automated. And that will not lend themselves to allowing for a process of full proletarianization as most of the rest of the world is seeing. And this is the author's kind of explanation for why sub-Saharan Africa remains the only part of the world that has seen massive population growth and why it doesn't seem to necessarily have an end in sight if the current trends prevail, which is kind of like the big, apostrophe, or not apostrophe, asterisk on this whole article, which is there are a number of quote unquote exogenous factors that could change this. But at the current moment, this is why you're seeing such strong population growths. And, it is also places like Pakistan and Afghanistan, but mainly it is sub-Saharan Africa. It's because this process of proletarianization has not been completed, and there are not necessarily prospects in the author's analysis for it ever being completed, at least not anytime soon.
And I guess why so much sort of fixed capital investment has been made into China, even those things that can be offshored. There's only so many times there's any reason to offshore technical industrial production,
Yeah. China, dude.
China.
I was just saying this to you beforehand. The scale of China is staggering. It's fucking crazy. And this is just when he discusses China in here, the biggest question in my mind is what does a China that has a population of almost 1.4 billion now, what does that look like when its population drops by like almost 800 million? Or if you look up any of these population numbers online, you're going to find a million different projections because this stuff is complicated to model. He's using particularly like holy shit models, which I'm not saying those are necessarily wrong. I think the general trend in all of them is entirely true. There will be a massive population decline in most of the world, save sub-Saharan Africa. But like China's is on just a completely other level. It's like, what does that place look like in 70 years? I don't know. It's like, good God. Grim. That's what it looks like. Yeah.
One of the interesting things in this essay is the degree of skepticism that he has toward various kind of like social democratic ways of attempting to sort of like solve this issue, sort of like through taxation, through redistribution, through sort of generally making it easier to support a family or a growing family in contemporary Western economies. All the evidence that he cites says that even where those things have been attempted, they don't really seem to have had the desired effect in terms of increasing fertility rates. So I guess the only point there is from the standpoint of like general social democracy, even if we were to have some kind of even vaguely muscular social democracy that decided to come in, whether it could have any successful impact on this is very much in question, I suppose.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it was a very interesting point that he makes about how capital accumulation, despite the argument that Marx makes, it really does only influence these things indirectly, in kind of the Marxist sense of using the term indirectly, right? And that it does actually still require states to come in and either, reward people with tax breaks for having kids, or like throw women in prison, I guess, for trying to get abortions on the other end of that scale. You reminded me of my favorite sentence fragment in this entire thing, which is he's talking about Keynes. Keynes does not come across particularly well in this essay. And he starts talking about Keynes. He gives a quote, something that he said, and then he says, Keynes delivered this 1937 lecture before a eugenics society, comma, of which he was the vice president, comma. I was just like, oh, okay, Jesus. Just going to brush past that one. It's like, yeah, it's just a kind of a masterful way where he kind of just, shows you the mask off moment of social democracy, which is like, yes, okay, this is what it's all about. Yeah, I see. Grim. It reminded me, we didn't talk about this when we talked about LL Men, but I meant to bring it up when there's like a throwaway sentence in there when LL Men is talking about like space travel for some reason. And he's like, given the current rate of the space race, capitalists will need to not only expand to Mars, but in 40 years, they'll probably expand past the solar system. And I was like, oh, if only you knew how bad it was. If only you knew. Oh, man. Unfortunate. What are you going to do?
Yeah. It both didn't happen in that way, and it's now happening.
In a bad way.
In the worst possible way.
Worst possible way. I'm gonna incredibly cringe. It all sucks. It's all terrible and incredibly bad. It was very cool to see the SpaceX
I haven't watched that video yet.
It's catching the rocket. Crazy. It's actually, talk about like some foundation shit. That is like, whoa, it was crazy. Great.
Wow, we could be living in that world.
We could be living in that world. How cool would that be? Where there are 2 billion people on the planet and we all engage in space tourism.
Rocket catch.
Rocket catching. Dear. Yeah. Well, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, the one other thing I'd say, we hinted at the doom, but the, quote unquote exogenous factors here that will make these population numbers maybe not necessarily reliable. The general trend is obviously going to be reliable, but it's things like climate change. And it's, obviously like how, given the like hollowed out nature of any state that's ever could remotely be considered a welfare state, given the state of, ongoing state of austerity and, most nations around the world in response to a rapid decline in capital accumulation, how quickly does capitalism find itself just kind of completely unable to cope as a social mode of organization as soon as these demographic rates really start to present a problem? And really start to present a problem, he's kind of saying in maybe 30, 40 years, you know what I'm saying? Not necessarily even by the end of the century. We were joking at the beginning of this podcast about the last couple lines are him basically being like, but this offers opens up a space for organizing. But it's like, yeah, how quickly does the system of commodity production find itself completely unable to cope? Because, if all of this stuff is managed indirectly through states, it's like, maybe not long, you know what I'm saying? But we'll see. Talk about being born at a great time. What are you going to do?
So sort of a little glimpse of us, what I suspected to be an underlying left communism at the end of this, where maybe people will come together and do social reproduction on a small scale. And,
he's hinting at the commune. I see what you're saying.
The commune,
this ever elusive commune. Yes. No, we didn't get a reference
not to impute any political.
Put him on the list. We didn't get a reference to the Invisible Committee, so maybe not. Although I actually didn't check the references, so maybe the Invisible Committee, the coming insurrection. What are you gonna do? Yeah. So basically, we're going to be getting old right at the time where like pensions are just completely thrown out the window.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome.
We'll have to spend 50% of our time attempting to foment some kind of socialist revolution, and the other 50% of our time
begging the social democrats
and creating some kind of autonomous community for ourselves to live in.
Exactly. I'll be spending at least 10% of my time begging social democrats for crumbs, but we'll see. We should all do that. All right. They always come crawling back to social democracy. That's it. I mean, it's grim, but again, what are you going to do? This is the set of it's the operational environment we were given. So maybe he is correct at the end of this, just to be like, hey, people will be disillusioned. So maybe states fall apart.
This is using historical materialism to predict the future in such a such a clear and direct degree that we can just know exactly what to do.
We know the second that we're going to get communism.
Yes.
When the demographic rates, decline to this point,
when the population of the Earth reaches X.
Malthus was right all along, except he should have been a communist. Oh well. All right. Well, on that note, thank you, Dan. This was
thanks, Jack.
Enlightening, if not enjoyable.
Yeah. I'm excited for the future. It'll be great.
All right. See you later.
Bye.
Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.